Ciao guys, and welcome to my, what is it, the fifth part of this guide. This guide is gonna be about positioning and surviving in 3 versus 3 arena as a Shadow Priest. Now, as some kind of a disclaimer, this is going to be strictly for 3v3 arena. So this does not cover 1v1s or 2v2s, okay? Because for the majority of this guide, I presume you have a healer with you, so that's not always the case in a 2v2, and that's definitely not the case in a 1v1. Okay, so let's start with positioning. As a Shadow Priest, your mobility is very limited if you get slowed or snared. So positioning yourself well is very important. Now, positioning depends on a lot of things, right? It depends whether you have to stay defensive or you want to push in. This relates to what I talked about in the last video, about knowing when to stay defensive and when to go offensive. Also, it depends on the comp you play, the comp you face, who you're going for, who are the enemy trying to kill, and even the arena that you're playing in. So I can't really cover all those combinations in one video, but for the sake of consistency, here are some general guidelines that should apply to everything. I would say the first rule and the most important one is don't line of sight your healer. And there's two reasons for this. One, the obvious one, you don't want to force him in a bad spot to heal you. And two, so that you can grip his scatters or mass dispel his CC or fear ward him when you see an enemy priest going for a fear. You know, stuff like that. So yeah, never line of sight your healer. If you lost your healer, he's gonna be forced to come out into the open and heal you. And that means he can no longer peek, which is doing it like this, you know, just coming out, healing, then going back in line of sight again. And of course he's gonna get CC'd if he's in the open. He's gonna get feared, you know, feared into Africa. Welcome to Africa. Now, if you play with a warrior or some melee, things are a little bit different, because you generally want your melee to be pushing in and force the enemy team in their own spot, and you can stay in the open and just turret at them, right? So that would be the ideal situation if you're playing with the melee. Now, for the rest of this guide, I'm gonna consider you play God comp, which I play, which is Shadow Priest, Frost Mage, and Resto Druid. Now let's start with when you're fighting a caster team. Okay, so when you're offensive, or if you're fighting a caster team, you are pretty safe to stay in the open and try to push in on the enemy team. This way your healer can stay behind both you and your mage, so he would be way harder to CC. And if they do decide to go in for CC on your healer, they need to overextend, and overextending versus a god comp can prove to be quite deadly. However, you must make sure that your healer is always at the max range behind you, and that he is not, you're not line of sighting him, of course. Now, what about if you have melees training you? Well, the best position for you would be, in theory, out of the enemy's healer's line of sight. That way the enemy melee is forced into a bad position if he wants to stay on you. However, by turtling behind a pillar with a warrior in your face will usually make it a lot easier for him to CC your own healer, who would probably be behind the pillar next to you. And you might even line of sight a heal mid-cast if you run around the pillar. So even in this situation, staying in the open and relying on heals and peels would still be the best choice in most cases. Your aim, position-wise, while getting trained by a melee, should be never to line of sight your healer while staying at a considerable distance from him, and at the same time move into a spot so that the enemy healer can no longer reach the melee, either because of range or line of sight. Therefore, the enemy healer will be forced out into the open, and that will leave him vulnerable to CC. Now, if you're fighting a melee cleave but they decide to tunnel your partners, usually your mage, then you're pretty much free to do your thing, outside of some random small CC they throw on you. So in these situations you want to play extra offensive and stay somewhere in between the enemy DPS and their healer, meaning it's up to you to CC the enemy healer and fear him and silence him on cooldown pretty much, while turreting damage with your own cooldowns on another enemy who's stuck in a deep, right? So as a summary, things you should keep in mind is your healer's positioning and the enemy healer's positioning. So your aim in pretty much every game should be to have your own healer as far back as possible and in your line of sight, and at the same time give the enemy healer a hard time healing his partners, right? That would be ideal. Of course, against certain comps, certain spell cleave comps, you want to make sure you do have a pillar next to you in case of chaos bolts, ascendants, and all that kind of whack stuff in the game that can one-shot you. Right, so if we're on the subject of you blowing up, let's talk a little bit about surviving. Now let's talk a little bit about how to stay alive. Now, in theory, again, if you don't line of sight your healer and he's not CC'd, you shouldn't die. In reality, however, you will get hit by 150k slams and 200k chimera shots and 300k chaos bolts, and you will just end up randomly popping in a blanket silence on the healer. If you allow 2 DPSers to hit you all the time, of course. So again, you have to be wary of your positioning and try to CC one of them, especially when they burst. Now I'll go over a few of our defensive, not cooldowns necessarily, but defensive abilities and what you can do to mitigate damage, right? So first off, we have Fade, with the glyph, of course, glyph of Fade, which reduces damage taken by 10%. Use Fade as a mini dispersion, right? First off, it's off global cooldown, so you can use it pretty much whenever you want. And Fade should be your first reaction, again, if you play with the glyph, and you should. So Fade should be your first reaction when you get Frost Orbed, when you see Recklessness or any other cooldown being used on you. More often than not, Fade is not going to be enough, but since it's off global cooldown, it's a great idea to have it as a first reaction. Use Palm, which is Prayer of Mending, pretty much as often as you can afford the global cooldown. And you want to use this even more against dot cleave teams like Shadowplay, or anything with the Boomkin, or Affliction Warlock, or Shadow Priest, or even Decay, right? Because you're gonna have that Prayer of Mending bouncing between all your allies, and you know that's gonna add up and it's gonna do a lot of healing overall. So Palm is pretty good. Use it as often as you can afford the global cooldown. Shielding, using Power Word Shield is a decent idea. The shield is good, right? It absorbs about 60k. The problem with shield is it drains a ton of mana, so make sure you can get your mana back with those vampiric touches. If you have a really hard time throwing those vampiric touches out, I would suggest you don't shield that often. Just shield if you really have to, like consider it a burst heal, right? If you really have to, then do it, but if you can't put those vampiric touches out, if you have no problem putting vampiric touches out, then sure, just shield on cooldown whoever you want, right? Shielding is really good. Okay, is there something to be said about Renew? Well, Renew is kind of trash. You can use it if you want. I use it quite often, but in all honesty, that 5k to 7k heal every 3 seconds is pretty much worthless. I like using it. It feels like it feels a global cooldown when I get trained, so go ahead, use Renew. However, don't use Renew on, like, if you're getting bursted, right, or your partners are in trouble, you don't want to Renew. Renew is not actually worth the global cooldown. You would be much better off going out of Shadow Form and casting a Flash Heal. But if you're fighting something, again, like a dot cleave that tends to drain your HP away slowly, then sure, go ahead and Renew yourself. It heals, it helps that little bit. And I think the last thing here would be to use Spectral Guise. Now, Spectral Guise is awesome when you want to sneak in for those ninja fears. However, many times you will be forced to use it as a defense. And the way you use it as a defense is when you pop it, you're not gonna stay invisible for too long, right? I'm talking again with the melee on you, but even with a spellcaster, because as soon as you get 3 hits, you're gonna get out of stealth. So you're not gonna be in stealth for more than, let's say, a second. The good thing about it though is it clears the enemy's target. So if they have target on you and you Spectral Guise, then they have to retarget you again. So in most cases you can Spectral Guise and then immediately cast Mind Blast or a Vampiric Touch. Again, in most cases you will get it off. Sometimes you will get it reflected or you will get pummeled, but thanks to the server delay and the way the server delay works, you know, by the time they actually see you, your cast would be a good halfway, right? And then they have to target you and interrupt. So usually you would get those off. So that's how you use spectral guise defensively. There's a bit more to be said about spectral guise and other tricks, but I'm gonna save that for the next video. You can click it over here. Now I think the biggest skill you should have in order to stay alive would be managing your cooldowns. And the way you do this is by communicating with your healer. Now, you don't want to overlap defensive cooldowns with your healer, and this happens at even high ratings. I've seen Guardian used with Ice Block, Life Swap and Vanish, I don't know, Dispersion with Spirit Link, etc. Right? You want to cycle them. So if your healer is, let's give an example, right? Let's say your healer is blinded and you're in trouble, right? You can disperse and your healer can sit the blind. If he gets feared out of that, you can then spectral guise and mass dispel the fear. And if he gets pollied out, then he can trinket and keep you up. So again, the most important thing is communicating, and it really all comes down to communicating and deciding when and what you should use. A good healer will tell you if you're in trouble and he can't pick you back up by himself. However, do not be afraid to use your cooldowns even really early, right? Especially versus rogue teams. Here's an example of a good or decent way to cycle through cooldowns. As you can see, my shaman got sapped over here and I got opened on by this rogue. As soon as they open on me, I ask if I need to disperse because I know rogue teams open pretty hard. Now I looked at this rogue. If you see right here, he has no shadow blades. He does have shadow dance and tricks of the trade, and of course his normal procs, but no shadow blades. So that's why I didn't, I might not have to disperse right away, right? You hear my mage right here is calling for a sheep, so I don't have to disperse. So he's doing a really good job peeling. He has a ring down, which is gonna freeze most of the pets and even the rogue at some point, I think. And for that reason I don't have to disperse right away. Now my shaman gets feared right after that sap. He's going to tremor it. So here I do trinket the kidney shot because I'm getting quite low and I want to fear both the DPSs and possibly even the priest. The problem is the stampede. When hunters have stampede up, that's 5 pets I think. Plus his normal pet, that's 6 pets. And our fear can only fear 5 people or 5 creatures, right? And it takes the closest 5. So fearing right there was a really big mistake for me. I think I ended up fearing most of his zoo. My shaman does tremor the fear, and then he gets put into a blank silence by the hunter. So as you can see in that really small window, I almost die, and they all call for dispersion and I do disperse at quite low HP. And now my healer is getting scattered and he's about to get trapped. I'm sitting on him in order to get his trap. I was expecting a trap, but he gets blind instead. So now I'm pretty much all out of cooldowns. But still, he still has a lot of abilities to use. So he's going to trinket the blind and the wyvern sting. And since right now they have no more CC and their burst is more or less over, at least the rogue's burst is over, we can start getting control of the game back. Right? Our shaman can start picking me up quite easily, and we can start putting pressure back again. We got to survive that because we didn't overlap cooldowns. If I were to disperse the opener and the shaman would have trinketed the sap, then I was probably dead. I would die for sure in the next blind. So that's a decent example, I guess, of how to cycle through cooldowns. Now here is a bad one. And I'm gonna show you this more of as a joke. The thing is, either me or the mage, probably the mage should have trinketed the sap, because he still has ice block, and he should have peeled for the shaman, because this happens. Both me and the mage decide to save our trinkets, and so does the shaman, and nobody uses any ability and we lose the game without using anything. So that's a bad example. Okay, so what you should get from this is communicating is extremely important. You want to always tell your healer and your other partner what you are going through, what can you CC, when you can heal yourself, when you can dispel them, and pretty much everything, right? So what the hell can you do when you do get trained by a melee? I know it can seem hard to get casts off with a melee on you, but you pretty much have to do it. Just make sure you don't get locked if you're in danger. That means if your HP is getting pretty low or your healer is about to get CC'd, don't get locked, because then you can't disperse and then you're just gonna die. So you have to get used to getting trained pretty much and cast anyway. You're not gonna get as many casts off, of course, and you can't really move as much as you would like to, but try to at least have 1 or 2 vampiric touches out, and keep Shadow Word Pain on as many targets as you can. The more Shadow Word Pains you have, the more chances of your instant Mind Blast proccing. Other than that, you can pretty much Prayer of Mending yourself on cooldown. Spectral, if you really can't get any casts off, you can Spectral Guise to get a Vampiric Touch, but I would save Spectral Guise more for casting a Mass Dispel on your healer in case he gets trapped, let's say, rather than just wasting it to get one single Vampiric Touch off, right? Which is gonna get dispelled anyway, probably. Also, again, don't line of sight your healer. You cannot, if you line of sight your healer while you get trained, you're gonna die. Right? You're gonna CC yourself basically. So as you stay there and you get smashed in the face, what you want to do basically is still wait for your orbs, and you get orbs by relying on instant Mind Blast procs if you can't cast any Mind Blasts. And as soon as your mage can get the full sheep on the healer, and he does that by your positioning, right? So if you position yourself, as we said, in the like far away from the enemy healer, then your mage is going to have a much easier time shipping him. So when your mage does get the full ship on the healer, then you can start doing damage. So, you know, Shadow Fiend, do a Devouring Plague with as many orbs as you have, and since they will go for you, your mage should be able to basically PvE them down. And a free casting mage is really scary. And one last thing I want to say here is about keeping your partners up. There's not really a whole lot to tell, except, again, keep communicating with your arena mates. Have your healer tell you if you need to off-heal, or if you see him stuck in a warrior fear and your mage getting trained, you should either try to CC the enemy or just spam heal the mage using flash heal. You also communicate and let your healer know when you can dispel his CC, so he doesn't have to waste a trinket or any other cooldowns, right? So with this being said, the general part of this entire guide is over. I'm going to go over some tips and tricks in the next video, and the video after that will be more of a special one. I'm gonna talk about how to improve your overall playstyle and what you should do. You can click over here to head over to the next guide. There I'm gonna talk about some pretty neat tips and tricks. It's not gonna be a very long video, I think. And you can click over here to go to the main menu video thingy, okay? Thanks for watching, guys, and I hope this helped. See ya and good luck. Bye bye.